Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Buletin Awani Khas. We're continuing our discussion following the special address by Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim talking about the state of the economy. I'm joined now by Dr. Amjad Rabi, who is a special social security economist who's currently a visiting expert at University of Malaya's Social Wellbeing Research Centre. He recently co-authored a paper on safeguarding welfare amidst subsidy reform in Malaysia. And I wanted to begin there. Amjad, thank you for being on the show with me and spending your public holiday eve with us tonight. But, you know, in referring to the special address that we just heard the Prime Minister give, he gave us a quick snapshot of the health of the country's economy, and he also alluded to the start of the subsidy rationalisation beginning with diesel. Now I wanted to talk to you about that, the health of the economy and what we're spending our money on. Maybe you can share a little bit Malaysia's pattern of spending when it comes to maybe relative to our economic development level.
Thank you very much for having me, and good evening to you and to the viewers. Just to answer your question, I mean, we really need to look at Malaysia in comparison to countries at the same level of development. So Malaysia's spending, public spending relative to GDP, it's about 20% of GDP is the size of the government. Now, if you compare it with emerging Asia, not the developed countries in Asia, but countries that are emerging, they are spending about 30% of GDP. So we already 10% lower than emerging Asia.
Okay.
If you compare also with industrialized countries, it goes to 40%. Now, even I wanted to compare Malaysia with Africa. Now, even with Africa, Africa spent on average 21%. The public spending relative to GDP is 21%, Malaysia 20%. So to start with, is the spending level is lower, much lower than what we would expect for a country like Malaysia, even if we compare with Vietnam. Now, the pattern of spending also, we have distorted pattern of spending, and I'm glad that I heard the speech of the Prime Minister. He highlighted the issue of subsidies and the reform and the efforts of the government in that direction, because lots of money is being spent on subsidies, as we know. If we just make a comparison between the amount spent on subsidies and assistance in comparison to two important ministries, education and health, two sectors. Last year, it's above 80 billion ringgit was spent on subsidies and assistance. At the same time, for the same year, it was about the same amount was spent on education and health together. And that speaks volume. It's because education and health, those are very important for human capital. Right. This is the future of the country. So it's good to see the Prime Minister looking at this and signaling. It's been the signal for a bit of time, but signaling and assuring again that subsidies are being considered and will be looked at.
All right, so what you're saying is that Malaysia already doesn't spend enough, so maybe ranks slightly lower in terms of public spending relative to our economic development level. And what we're spending on subsidies and assistance programs. Can you break that down for me? Because it's not the same level of spending, right? We're spending more on subsidies than we are on social assistance programs.
Correct,
okay.
Correct. It's about 80% of that goes to subsidies.
80% of our, was it 8 billion you said?
80 billion.
80 billion.
So we have, yeah. And then the largest one, as we know, energy products subsidy.
So that's petrol, diesel.
Petrol, diesel, and petrol RON 95 is the highest. And we need to look at it and what's the rationale, why we need to reform it. I'll give you this example that I was working in another country on subsidy reform. So I was going through the big books, and I usually like to look at historical, like the pattern of spending. And in the old books, I saw that the country was subsidizing cigarettes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's, to me, I laughed actually. And then it's like cigarettes, it's very illogical. But that generation, it was logical to them. It was consumed by the poor, local industries. So the same way we laughed at this, our children will laugh at us when they look at that we subsidize gasoline. So we really need to think about it also in terms of the signal we're sending to our spending pattern. Okay. Now, there is economic function for, or economic less or reason why we need to remove this gasoline subsidy. It's now, in Malaysia, it's market economy. So in market economy, the price signals or it's used the price mechanism to allocate resources from one sector to another. Now, if you alter the price mechanism, usually you should alter it for, import things that healthy or other things. But if you alter it, it means you favor certain sector over another. So that creates impediments for Malaysia to transition into the green economy, which is now is growing. It's not only important for the environment, but it's a growing industry that it will leave Malaysia behind. So it's very important to correct this distortion for economic function. And this is, of course, in addition to the other important issues related to fuel and subsidies generally are regressive. So it benefits the poor. Malaysians, also bottom 40, they have cars. If you go to PPR, you see cars there. But the rich have bigger cars and more cars. So one study by Ministry of Domestic Trades, each household top 20, they receive 219 ringgits, the equivalent 219 ringgits per month for fuel subsidy. In comparison to bottom 40, 119. So that's very regressive pattern of spending. So when we correct it, should be all the way around. So that's very important aspect also to keep in mind.
All right, Amjad, I want to come back and talk to you about who we need to protect during this subsidy rationalization rollout. But right now, let's cross over to economist Dr. Jeffrey Williams, who's joining us on the line. Jeffrey, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Jeffrey. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining me. Can I get your initial thoughts very quickly on the PM's special address? How are you reading what he said, what he announced?
I think he's trying to summarize what the government has been doing so far, what the main plans of the government are, and also the current position of the economy, particularly emphasizing the potential for growth, questions about inflation, and of course, most importantly, big changes in the process for the subsidy rationalization for petrol and diesel, starting first with diesel. So I think what he was really trying to do is to help people to understand that there is a strategy and what the strategy is.
All right. So he's prepping the ground for the beginning of the subsidy rationalization rollout, and he's going to start with diesel. Now I want to ask you whether this is the right time to do it and how you think you would like to see it be done. So we're right now 17 months into the Madani government. We're less than halfway through what would be a full tenure. Is this a good time? Is this a good spot for this government to swallow the bitter pill of subsidy rationalization, particularly if you take into account what's happening with the global economy? Is this a good time, Jeffrey?
Well, I think there's never a perfect time, but I think the current economic environment is probably about as good as it's going to get. So, yes, this is probably a good time to begin to start this process. But I think we also need to remember that the diesel change that the Prime Minister has announced tonight is not the start of the process, because we've already seen changes in subsidy rationalization in electricity, for example. And we've seen changes in the floating of the chip prices, for example. And we've seen the introduction of the PADU system, which has happened all very quickly, actually. So, although we're starting now to see some changes on the big area of subsidies, which is petrol and diesel, it's not really fair to say that the government has been slow in the subsidy rationalization process. Okay. Actually, the government has been undertaking this for several months already.
Okay, so are you concerned about inflationary pressures then? I mean, there's always a concern that as subsidies are rolled back, this might lead to inflation. How valid are these concerns?
The inflation environment is much better than it's been recently, and actually, I'm not too concerned that the staged process or the sequence process of removing the diesel subsidies is going necessarily to have a big push on inflation. In fact, one of the reasons it's a good idea to start to do this process now is because inflation has come down significantly. It's much lower than it was before, and we expect it to be more normal this year than it has been in the past. So whilst there's always a possibility that there will be a pass-on effect into prices, consumers have to be wary of that, in my view, and they have to be smart about it. There's no particular reason why these relatively small changes in diesel subsidies, for example, should necessarily cause a significant increase in consumer prices.
Right. Is this going to make a big difference, Jeffrey, to government coffers? What are you hoping the government spend this saved money on? Well,
the electricity subsidy change will save about 4 billion. The chicken price change will save about 1.2 billion, and now this new diesel change will save another 4 billion. So collectively, that's 9.2 billion. But we have to remember that in December there will be an increase in civil service pay. So much of that saving will be taken up by the increase in the expenditure on civil service salaries. So the government will still need to look at fiscal consolidation, and it will need to look at better ways of raising revenues, in my view.
Right. Jeffrey, can I also ask you, so the Prime Minister said in his speech that he's going to, we'll wait for more details to be announced regarding the diesel subsidy rationalization. And I wanted to ask you what you will be looking out for. What should we be watching out for when the details of this diesel subsidy rollout comes out?
Well, for me, I think the biggest issue is that whether the new subsidy system will reduce the corruption and the loss, because we know that from diesel subsidies in particular, there's a very significant wastage, leakage, and corruption issue. And if the new system can help to reduce those losses, that will be clearly beneficial to everybody else. We also need to know that actually the change in the diesel subsidies won't have too big an impact on businesses, so that they won't be harmed by this change. That's really what we're looking at now. That's the issue with rationalization. Rationalization, as the Prime Minister quite rightly pointed out, isn't always about reducing the subsidy. It's about doing it in a better way. In the long term, we should be able to reduce the subsidies very significantly, but for the moment, doing it in a step-by-step basis. The aim is to make it more efficient in terms of how the subsidies are implemented. Subsidies are not efficient, unfortunately, but if you're going to have them, it's better to have a more efficient approach, and that's what we need to look at when we see the details.
Right. Thank you so much for speaking with me. That was economist Dr. Jeffrey Williams. We're going to take a quick break here on Buletin Awani Khas, and we will be right back, so stay tuned. Hi, welcome back. I'm Melisa Idris. You're watching Buletin Awani Khas, and we're continuing our discussion following the Prime Minister's special address earlier this evening, talking about the state of the economy. I have in the studio with me Dr. Amjad Rabi, who is a social security economist currently a visiting expert at UM's Social Wellbeing Research Centre. Amjad, I just wanted to focus on the fact that, okay, so now we have this phasing out of the blanket subsidy system, the universal subsidy system in a short term. And while this holds potential to free up substantial fiscal space for the country, what should the money be spent on? And how do we ensure that this doesn't hurt the very vulnerable of our society?
And it's very important, I think, because as we would expect, inflation will happen. I mean, hopefully not, especially now we see, as Dr. Jeffrey said, inflation is declining, but generally it causes inflation from experience in other countries. And inflation affects certain groups of the population, especially the poor. However, where we wanted to be careful here, we don't want to remove blanket subsidy and give a blanket assistance. And it's very difficult to determine the income of every individual, right? Because many people work in the informal economy. So yes, income is very difficult to capture. And we have a lot of evidence that the targeting based on income does not work.
The exclusionary errors,
error. And we've seen that in the latest studies. So what we wanted to do is try to look at the population into three different groups. The three different groups, one is pre-working age So before people start working, children, and the working and the post-working. So when we remove subsidy, we wanted to make sure, especially two groups that are not affected, children and senior citizens. Children, because it's very damaging to the development of the child if they make a choice to reduce the healthy food they eat, or it affects their cognitive development. And I use the word pre-working because they will join the labor force at one point. You want them to be joining the labor force with full potential to contribute to the economy. Senior citizens, because they are overrepresented in poverty. Now, Melissa, if you look at poverty, relative poverty, the rate in Malaysia is 16%, the relative poverty. The group that highest is senior citizens, 42%, in comparison with national average of 16%. So we need to prioritize our senior citizens in this. And children, because it's the future. Now, for the ones, and this is always challenging, what about the ones they are working?
Yes.
Cash does not help. And it's not the right thing to do. It's better to give them skilling and the training and see how we can think smartly, how we can upskill this group. Like the issue in the working age population in Malaysia is wage, and wage we need to skill to bring the wage up.
Okay, so there are so many who say, what about the kind of middle income, right? The people who are too, quote unquote, rich to get government assistance, but too find it also difficult to kind of make a living or live comfortably in you know, the current cost of living circumstances. So you're saying cash assistance might not be the best way. It's more about skilling for them.
For the ones in the working age.
In the working.
Now, let's put it, you know, in very pragmatic way. Now, instead of, you know, going to ask people, do you have a fridge? Do you have, you know, many questions, and people then lie and
yes.
there is an easier way. Now, in Malaysia, we wanted to target, now there's almost consensus that you want them to include the middle income distribution, M40. And the Prime Minister in the speech, he highlighted also that STR reached already 6 million if you multiply by average of 4 individuals households, so 24 million. So it's already STR covers the middle. But instead of complicating it, asking people many questions, it's simpler to the bottom 40, middle 40, we say every child will receive certain amount of money, every senior citizen. However, if you are rich, or top 20, don't worry, we will remove you. How we will remove them? Because we have data on the rich. You have lots of information about already. That means the tax.
They're paying taxes.
The property, how many, you can say.
So it's easier to identify the people you need to exclude.
Exactly.
Rather than
you exclude them.
Falling through the cracks.
Exactly. And then the rest, you include them, right? That's much easier than to try to get 80% to prove that they are deserving. Just to exclude the 20. It's easier to exclude the 20, you get this much better result. Why I'm saying this, because I saw your coverage of the urban poverty issue, and what we've seen is alarming, and this is repeated. We did the same study in 2018, and now it's repeated that household with less than 2,000 ringgit living in PPR, 1/3 of them, so 1/3 of the poorest of the poor did not receive the social assistance.
Wow.
It's simply because when it's complex, people cannot know, they don't know, there is cognitive deficit on the ability to answer or to know about the many different programs. So the program tend to exclude them because of this issue. So we need to be smart, it costs less to exclude the rich.
Okay, so you mentioned a bit earlier that you have worked in other countries on subsidy reform, and I'm curious to know, I mean, I'm saying you've worked in many countries, I think double-digit countries now in this currently. So talk to me about how we can safeguard welfare. So what do policymakers in Malaysia need to know throughout this process of subsidy reform that we're going through as a country? How do we ensure that welfare is safeguarded?
I think I can give you two examples. One is good, one is bad. So now let me start with the one is bad. It's next to us is Indonesia. Okay. Indonesia, they reformed the subsidy in 2015, around that time. And they decided to target the bottom 40, right? And first, the statistics that from Indonesia that they're supposed to target the bottom 40 and then ended up excluding 70% of the bottom 20 because of the issue we shared. Secondly, now you have a subsidy that benefit the middle, right? The gasoline subsidy benefits people in the middle.
Yeah.
Now, you exclude them because you include only the 30%. What they will do? In Indonesia, they were protests at that time. 35% of villages went into protest. Now, Indonesia, there was a luck there that when they did it, the oil price was declining. So that was absorbed. Now it doesn't look like it, you know. So it's very important to learn from the lesson not to exclude the middle, to make sure that we include them. We give children, senior citizens, and skilling for the working, and you exclude the rich without asking the poor too many questions. Now, the good example, you'll be surprised, the best example in this, I mean, we're not going to get developed country do fuel subsidy reform because they tax fuel.
Right.
So we don't have examples from. But we have the best examples from Iran. Iran, under pressure, they had to reform the fuel subsidy because there were lots of sanctions and others. So then they were afraid also, as you'd expect, you know, this is something can be politically, you know, sensitive matter. So what they decided, they said, okay, we're going to remove the fuel subsidy. We will inject to every household a large amount of money. It's actually 29% of the median income to every household.
29%?
29. So it's 1/3 of the income.
Good.
And give everyone, right? So they give every household. So no one is excluded. They give them. This is one. And the second one, they double investment on health. So public health in Iran, similar to Malaysia. Now Malaysia spend on health 2.2% public health of GDP. Iran at that time, they were also around that number. When they did the fuel subsidy, they said, clearly we will double what we give to Minister of Health. So now people feel it. You know, you go now, bringing the doctors to villages, people felt it. Now poverty in Iran, headcount poverty reduced by half because of the fuel subsidy reform and injecting 29%, as I mentioned, the median income and health. It went by 50%, and in rural area it was much higher, the reduction in poverty. It's one of the, really I cannot think of a better example that how they did it. And there were no protests, nothing, because, you know, everyone benefited at the end of the day.
What a remarkable story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I appreciate it. And thank you for spending time with us and sharing your insights. That's all we have for you on Buletin Awani Khas tonight. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.